It's a female,
Okay.
December 30th, 1960,
1960. Time?
2:34 a.m.
Love that. 2:34 a.m. Place?
in Reading, Reading, Pennsylvania.
Thank you for saying it because I would have completely have said reading. There's a Reading, Massachusetts as well, I know. All right, everyone. So this is our first chart for the day, and just check in with her to make sure that this is correct. 6 degrees Scorpio, 39 minutes.
That's correct.
Okay, good. And Cindy just told me this is number 9. Cindy, you're a trooper because that means you've probably been here for all 9 of them. So thank you for being here again. All right, everyone. So this is our blind chart reading number 9 within our blind chart reading marathon. And the date of birth for this chart is December 30th, 1960 at 2:34 a.m. in Reading, Pennsylvania. And the ascendant of this chart is 6 degrees Scorpio, 39 minutes, which we absolutely positively love. And the reason why we love a 6 degree Scorpio rising is because we feel more certain about that than a 0 degree Scorpio rising. And we feel more certain about the 6 degree Scorpio rising than a 29 degree Scorpio rising. And the reason for that is because when we have those early degrees and late degrees of a sign rising, particularly 0 degrees or 29 degrees, just a minute or two of time would make the ascendant change from one sign to the next. And from a traditional perspective, that's something very important to us because the ascendant is one of the most important things within our chart in general. So we want to make sure that we have the correct ascendant. And if we're using systems of astrology that aren't as sign of the zodiac heavy as traditional astrology, then having the ascendant off by a degree or so could be okay because we wouldn't actually be reading into the sign that's on the cusp of the ascendant. But since we are going to use the sign on the cusp of this ascendant as an interpretive factor, we definitely do want to know what's going on. The first thing we see here is that this ascendant is 6 degrees of Scorpio, 39 minutes. Within the context of our Oraculos rubric of natal chart reading, the first thing we want to do is identify the hidden components, or we call them the hidden aspects, that are occurring to the ascendant. Now, there was a point in time when I thought that I wouldn't be displaying the entire Oraculos rubric within these blind chart readings, because to a very large degree, our rubric is our secret sauce at the Oraculos School of Astrology. The same rubric I'm teaching now is the same rubric that my students learn as well within the context of their 2-year diploma program. So I didn't actually want to give that away. However, the astrology I practice today is very different from the astrology I practiced a month ago. The astrology I practiced a month ago is very different from the astrology I practiced a year ago. And so I don't necessarily feel a grasping on or a fear of sharing with people exactly what we do at the Oraculos School of Astrology without any strings attached, because Oraculos is an evolving astrological community, and a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now, the shape and the face of Oraculos astrology is going to look different, because our astrology evolves and grows every single time we read a client's chart. So I dare say that in the month of October, this rubric, while it will always be the same rubric, the depth with which I approach it will be substantially different. So you're getting our actual in-class rubric because we are most definitely on a path of evolution and growth. So there you go. So the hidden aspects that we do or that we look for in relation to the ascendant are Antisha. And the reason why we look for Antisha is because Antisha is one of the most powerful aspect connections. So we look for the Antisha to the ascendant. And I know that 6 degrees of Scorpio equals 24 degrees of Aquarius. So I look and see, is there anything at 24 Aquarius? And the answer is kind of yes, because she has Venus within 1 degree of arc of that 24 degrees Aquarius, so I'm going to write the Venus down. She also has Uranus at 25 degrees Leo, which would be the contra Antisha. So I'm going to write that down because it's very joyful and it's a cause for celebration when we look for the Antisha or the contra Antisha of something and we find at least one of them fulfilled. In this chart, we find both of them fulfilled. So we write down the Venus as well as the Uranus. The next thing I do, because I'm a Uranian astrologer as well, is I look for the octiles. The octiles are the hard aspects that are divisible by the number 45. I know that 6 degrees of the fixed signs is equaling 21 degrees of the mutable signs. So I quickly look around the chart to see if she has anything at 21 degrees mutable. And the answer to that is no. So we move on. The final thing I do is the declination. And the declination to the ascendant here is we can see it. And I'll just circle that for you all. We can see that by declination, she is having the ascendant in a parallel relationship with Neptune and the ascendant in a contra-parallel relationship with Uranus. I use parallels and contra-parallels because they are very manifest as far as the manifestation of concrete events are concerned. And at Oraculos, we practice concrete event-based astrology. So we want to use all of the things that are concrete or that will give us concrete information. So we have Uranus and Neptune, and I don't differentiate between whether or not Uranus is in a contra-parallel to the ascendant and the fact that Neptune is parallel to the ascendant. And the reason for that is because ultimately all hard aspects work out evenly. So when it comes to using hard aspects purely based on what the planets represent, all of the hard aspects end up equaling the exact same thing. Guess what I'm not doing? Big stupid me. I'm not recording.
Recording in progress.
All right, so I'll just grab it from that video and figure out how to make that work. So all hard aspects work out evenly. So as a result of that, I don't need to distinguish between it being ascendant contra-parallel Uranus or ascendant parallel Neptune, because the fact of the matter is that this is ascendant in a conversation with Neptune and ascendant in a conversation with Uranus. And that's the most important thing for me. So the next thing we're going to do is take a look at the obvious stuff, we could call it, or the obvious considerations. The most obvious thing we will always note as far as astrology is concerned is the planets that are within the houses, because determination by location is immediate. That means that a planet is going to always have a far greater impact where it is, period. So if we find a planet in a house, that planet is going to have a far greater impact on the house in which it is located than if that planet were located elsewhere. So determination by location is immediate. We have the planets in the first house would be Neptune. The next thing we would do is take a look at aspects to the ascendant. And clearly the Neptune is there. We don't need to repeat that. We have Mercury in a sextile to the ascendant. Mercury 60 the ascendant. Mercury is L8, L11, L8, L11. The next thing we have is the Sun in a 60 to the ascendant. SO. We take the abbreviation for the Sun as SO because that is the German abbreviation of the Sun, because the word Sun in German is Sonne. So SO is the abbreviation. The Sun is the L10 or the ruler of the 10th house, and it's in a sextile to the ascendant. The Jupiter is a little bit too far for my liking. The Saturn is too far. This is too far. This is too far. This is a nothing. The Aries point is also a nothing. The parts of fortune in the quincunx to the ascendant, we'll write it down even though we're not exactly sure how that's going to manifest. But she has parts of fortune quincunx the ascendant, and it's doing that from the 8th. And we have the moon. I'll put down that she has the moon quincunx the ascendant as well, with the moon being L9. We will also take Mars in a 120 to the ascendant, with the Mars being the ruler of the first house as well as the ruler of the sixth house, which is always interesting. And then the final thing is we have the Pluto being in a 60 to the ascendant. So those are going to be all of the aspects that we have to the ascendant within this chart. Now, the very next thing we're going to do is the ruler of the ascendant, and after that we will begin. Ruler of the ascendant, and the ruler of the ascendant is the Mars at 8 degrees of Cancer, 47 minutes, retrograde in the 9th house of travel and higher education. So honestly, this is the base work or the groundwork of what we need to do in terms of understanding what's going on in this chart. If we wanted to take this a step further, we would do aspects to the ruler of the ascendant and then definitely begin after that. So we have the Mars picking up the sextile from the Pluto, Mars picking up the 60 from the PL, which really isn't doing that much for me. We also have the Mars picking up the 120 from the Neptune. We have the Mars picking up the 180 from the, or rather, we have the Mercury picking up the 180 from the Mars. And the reason why I changed saying Mars opposite Mercury to Mercury opposite Mars is because the faster moving planet always is going to be the one that comes in the front, because the faster moving planet is the one making the aspect. And the Mercury is ruling the 8th house. Mercury is L8. Mercury is also L11. We have the Sun in a 180 to the Mars, which is very tricky. This because the Sun is L10. We have the Mars in a 180 to the Jupiter, with the Jupiter being L2, L5. L2/5 on the Jupiter. And that's pretty much it we have as far as this chart is concerned. This is a complex one, and it's complex for many reasons, but we'll see how best we can parse it out. So the first thing we would do with this from a traditional perspective is we would start by looking at the sign on the cusp of the ascendant, because that's going to give us some context for how this lady is organizing herself, at least initially within her lifetime. And we'll then look at other things going on within this chart in order to see how strongly that initial organizing principle manifests. So she has 6 degrees of Scorpio rising, and Scorpio is a fixed water sign ruled by Mars. And this can say to us from a traditional perspective. Today we'll be exploring a couple perspectives. We'll explore the traditional perspective, we'll explore the cosmobiological perspective, we'll explore the Uranian perspective, and see how all of these things stand to balance when juxtaposed against each other. So with 6 degrees of Scorpio, 39 minutes rising, she has a fixed water sign ruled by Mars rising. And that can say to us that water is her chief operating system within this lifetime. It's saying to us that that person moves through the world from a place of depth. And that person moves through the world from a place of creating and establishing profound connections between themselves as well as others within their immediate environment. The entire nature of the water element is to take the shape of its environment. So there's something very porous about people who have a water sign rising in general, and that porousness can make them absorb the shocks that occur within their environment. Now, this could cause them to be a neutralizer of environmental trauma, but we're not meant to really neutralize environmental trauma by embodying that environmental trauma. One of the ways how the ancients characterized water as an element is they said that water was cold and wet. And as a result of it being cold and wet, they also thought that it corresponded with the cold and wet substance that exists within the human body. And that cold and wet substance for the ancients was called phlegm. And phlegm is a fancy word for snot. And the reason why I point this out is because if you are nearly as phlegmatic, and by phlegmatic I mean as snotty as I am, you have a good understanding of how snot operates. And snot is the sort of thing that when it lands on the surface, it doesn't move. It might jiggle from side to side, but it does not move. And the reason that I'm saying this is because that represents the shock absorbency of phlegm as a substance. And so for the ancients, anything that had the ability to absorb shock, whether that was the actual mucous membranes within our body, or whether that was the cartilaginous spaces that exist between our joints. For the ancients, all of these things represented a shock absorbency and a phlegmatic nature. And so that's what we find in the water element in general, this ability to absorb shocks and this ability to neutralize trauma. But one of the ways how water and snot does that is by taking it inside of themselves. So that's one of the drawbacks that we see with the water element in general. However, one of the positive things that we see about the water element is that it has the ability to understand the unspoken things that occur within the lives of others. We see this also manifesting in her life by virtue of having the Neptune rising. When we have Neptune rising, it makes something about our presence in the world that much more permeable. And as a result of that, we can understand other people in a deeper way. People don't even have to speak without us really understanding what they're going through on a deep cellular level. And so that is one of the things that can predispose a person like this to being able to work in a way with others where the other person can just stay silent and she can already pick up on the thoughts and the emotions of that person, which could very much let that person feel seen and acknowledged. This is one of the positive things that we see having Neptune rising. Another one of the challenges that we have with the Neptune rising is that very often when someone has Neptune rising, particularly when they have Neptune conjunct their ascendant, they could feel as if people don't even see them. So there can be a theme of invisibility that manifests within a person's life when they have Neptune conjunct the ascendant, Neptune rising, because it can create a scenario where they're just standing up in public and people are constantly bumping into them because the people just don't see them. It's as if they have on a cloak of invisibility. So there can be that aspect of the Neptune factor as well when we have it as a natal consideration. Now, this lady is having Mars ruling this ascendant, and the Mars is in the 9th house. Very often where we find the ruler of the ascendant within a chart is going to indicate what a person is gravitating towards and what a person is really building their life around. Julius Firmicus Maternus once wrote that when a person has the ruler of the ascendant in the 9th house, that person can become the messenger to the king or the advisor to the king. And that was one way of saying that this is one of the astrological signatures that exists within a person's chart. If a person has the rule of the ascendant in the 9th house, that can be an indication that this person will become an astrologer or that the person will be a good astrologer, because having the rule of the ascendant in the 9th house is one of our astrological signatures in general. And so, I mean, needless to say, we're here in an astrology blind chart reading, and chances are you're not here in an astrology blind chart reading unless you are an astrologer. But just to say that within her chart, we're seeing one of the things that we find oftentimes showing up traditionally as far as the assessment of one's astrological ability is concerned. Now, she has Mars in the sign of Cancer, which we know is the sign of Mars's fall, and that Mars is also retrograde there. When we have Mars in the domicile or the home of the moon, that can be a very interesting thing, especially in terms of how we navigate within the lunar spheres of our lives. It basically is more of what I was saying earlier in terms of being someone who can so deeply take in the shock and the pain and the trauma and all of the emotions. However, that can oftentimes manifest as a bottling in of those things and not necessarily knowing how to express them in the best of ways. And this is also something that we find through having the Neptune rising as well, because the Neptune rising can also manifest in a similar way where we feel so porous and we feel as if we're taking in everything from the world around us that we don't necessarily know how to sort out our own feelings and feel the full gamut of those so that we could work with our own emotions in a very healthy and a very constructive sort of way. So that could be one of the drawbacks that is happening as a result of the Mars being where it is. The ninth house is a house of foreign travel. The ninth house is also a house of long distance journeys. Now, very often, the textbook definition of having the ruler of the ascendant in the ninth house, that can also represent somebody who is relocating at a very early age or living far away, living far abroad at a very early age. Another thing that we would see from a textbook perspective is that a person who has the ruler of their ascendant in the ninth house could be a person who is coming out of the womb with a suitcase in their hand because they're ready to be on the road, they're ready to go out, they're ready to explore, they're ready to venture, they're ready to travel, they're ready to become peregrine. Peregrine essentially means being ready to be lost in the world. So that could be something that this native is also finding herself gravitating towards to a large degree as well. Now, moving on to talk about the aspects that this Mars is receiving. And even before we talk about the aspects this Mars is receiving, this Mars is ruling the first house and the sixth house. This is a very interesting thing because the first house is the house of health, the sixth house is the house of sickness, as many of us know. So when we have the ruler of the first house and the sixth house being the same planet, that oftentimes can indicate someone whose physical health is very strongly encumbered upon or very strongly encroached upon by stress. Now, my first default in terms of the sixth house is stress because it's a softer segue into the more challenging topics that the sixth house represents to talk about the sixth house as a house of stress than to start off by talking about the sixth house as the house of illness. It's easier for people, it's more palatable, it's more digestible when we say that the sixth house is representing that this native is living within a very high stress container within her life that has the ability to manifest as sickness or illness or any other form of stress-related issues or complications with her health later on in life than to initially dive for the jugular by saying that the sixth house is the house of the things that make us sick. So very often, when a person is having the rule of the ascendant and the rule of the sixth house be the same planet, that's a person who isn't knowing how to turn off their stresses. And that's a person who might always be on edge from a stress perspective because she's always finding herself in a state of not just work, but also overwork as well. And that can be very taxing on the physical vitality of the native. Now, from the perspective of overwork, we have the native as Mars in an opposition with the Sun, or rather, we have Sun in an opposition with Mars. And when a person is having Sun in an oppositional relationship with Mars, this gives a person, from a medical astrology perspective, an excess of firepower within this lifetime. Now, from a medical astrology perspective, that excess of fire is a very healthy thing because we want for somebody to have exceptional and extraordinary amounts of fire within this lifetime because having that excess of fire means that you can burn off whatever maladies or challenges come your way and you can quickly jump back into action. That is the textbook definition of Sun-Mars as a combination across every branch of astrology. Sun-Mars gives somebody an excess of physical power, an excess of muscular force with which to navigate themselves through the world at large. However, when we take into consideration the fact that this Mars is also ruling the sixth house, having this Sun-Mars connection could indicate that she doesn't know how to turn that excess of power off. And as a result of that, this is only further increasing her stressing her body out, her overtaxing her system, and her possibly doing things that might potentially jeopardize her health as a result of running on full power all of the time. And so that's something that we find with the Mars-Sun combination. It's a very athletic combination. In another chart, we might even say that it's a very competitive combination. And if she had the moon Mars as well with this, we would say that she could be someone who's doing very high intensity sports, because very often in the charts of women, when they're having moon Mars in hard aspect relationships, they prefer to do TRX, or they prefer to do powerlifting, or they prefer to do whatever the other something RX is that people do in the gym. They prefer to do very high intensity things, because that's one of the ways how moon Mars is manifesting specifically. She doesn't have that, but she does have the Sun Mars combination. So that's one of the things we see within this chart. She also has the Mercury Mars combination. Now, for anyone who's ever listened to any of my astrological forecasts, you know that I always throw Mercury and Venus in there, and the only fast-moving planet that I don't throw in my monthly forecast is the moon, because if you threw the moon in there, you'll always have something to say about the moon, and I don't really like to work that hard. So she has the moon in opposition, or rather, she has the Mercury in opposition to the Mars. This is one of the textbook combinations that we find manifesting within the charts of people who get migraines, or the charts of people who get tension headaches, or the charts of people who get very overwhelmed mentally. And one of the reasons for that is because Mercury Mars can manifest as someone having fire in the brain. And so that fire in the brain can very much manifest as migraines, as tension headaches, and as other things where we don't really know how to shut off the stress factor from a mental perspective. And so that's keeping us constantly in a state of thought generation. And as a result of that, it's probably causing us to be overstimulated mentally, and that could be manifesting as migraines within the life of this native. So we would want to say to her to find more ways to step into more calming activities, or to step into things that don't necessarily overtax you or overburden you, because one of the things that could potentially be the result of that overtaxation is migraines, tension headaches, fatigue, all of those things. So that's the Mercury Mars. Now we have this Mercury in the opposition with the Mars, with the Mercury ruling the 11th house as well as ruling the 8th house. The 11th house, as we know, is a house of our friends specifically. So having Mercury, the ruler of my house of friends, in opposition to Mars, the ruler of myself, could, from a traditional astrology perspective, be interpreted as I find it very difficult to have long-lasting, everlastingness between me and my friends, because they're always saying something stupid that's always causing us to end the relationship, or they're always doing something, or I find myself constantly in a state of contention with them. So it might be difficult for me to really feel a sense of longevity in terms of friendships as a particular connection. Now, she also has the Pluto in a conjunction with her North Node, which is basically Pluto node as a story in general in astrology. And when a person is having Pluto node as a story in general, very much like all the babies being born right now with Pluto at the bendings in a square relationship with the nodes, that can oftentimes be an indication of a karmic ending pattern in terms of relationships. So that could sometimes be a story of the relationships that constantly end. And so we see that that could be manifesting very strongly within her life in terms of her friendships as a result of having the Mercury ruling the 11th house in opposition to the Mars as the ruler of the ascendant. Now, another thing that this Mercury is doing is the Mercury is also ruling the 8th house. And Mercury ruling the 8th house is a little bit tricky, because from a traditional, very much old school traditional astrology perspective, having the Mercury in the 3rd house in opposition to Mars in the 9th house ruling the 8th house, an astrologer in the 13th century probably would have said that we need to contextualize something first. As far as 13th century astrology is concerned, we all should have died many, many moons ago. And the reason for that is because the 13th century was a far more challenging period within which to live than the 21st century, which I'm sure we could imagine. So, once again, this lady was born in the year 1960. So whatever we're saying, whatever you can say to a person who was born in the year 1960, in the year 2023, is something that has already transpired within the context of their lives. So everything we're saying it from a retrospective perspective, which is lovely because it roots our language safely in the past. And if it's wrong about something that's in the past, basically. So having the ruler of the 8th house in opposition to the Mars ruling the 1st house from the 3rd house and the 9th house, in the 13th century, they would have said that this could have been a person who was probably rolled over by her chariot of horses or something to that effect. In the 21st century, our chariot of horses could very well be our car or something within that sphere of things, and that could represent that earlier within the life of this native, there could have been a major vehicular story or a major vehicular crisis that remains a part of her life, and that remained a part of how she organized the rest of her life since that event occurred. And the reason why we speak about a major vehicular story is because the 3rd house is the house of short distance journeys, and the 9th house is the house of long distance journeys. And very often when somebody has an opposition to themselves from their 3rd house of short distance journeys, it can oftentimes have something to do with a vehicular story that is representing a very real source of trauma or crisis within the life of the native. Adding to that, the fact that this Mercury is ruling the 8th house, which to this day remains the 8th house of death, debt, and other people's money, could refer to the fact that there could have been a near-death experience within the earlier life of this person as far as a vehicular story is concerned. And so that's all we have to say about that. We don't have to take that any further. Now, with the Mercury also ruling the 8th house, which we know is also the house of the partner's money, we can say that this lady is probably finding herself in a bit of a war. And the reason why we say war is because it's an opposition. So every word we say in astrology has to be rooted in our astrology. Our language can't come from nowhere. So we can say that having the ruler of the 8th house in opposition to the ruler of the 1st house could represent there being a sense of warfare between myself and the monies of my partner. And the reason for that is because the 8th house continues to represent the monies of my partner from a modern astrology and traditional astrology perspective. So this could be another relationship in which we see the monetary dynamic becoming a very real source of challenge within this person's life, or within this person's specific love life and romantic life. Now, moving on from that, we have the Jupiter that is having an oppositional relationship with the Mars, or rather the Mars having an oppositional relationship with the Jupiter. And this is interesting because this Jupiter is representing her own money. So the story of money, the theme of money is coming up in two ways. It's coming up in several ways, actually. And the several ways are that we have the money of my job, which is the 11th house, because if the 10th house is your job, the 11th house is the money you make from your job. The money from my job is ruled by the Mercury. It's in opposition to me. It isn't looking like the money from my job is having the greatest day in the world. And it also isn't looking as if I'm having the greatest day in the world in relation to the money from my employment. So that's one thing we see through the Mercury Mars. Another thing we see is that my personal money is Jupiter in Capricorn, because the Jupiter is ruling my 2nd house, and it's in it's having an oppositional relationship with me, which can be another indication that in general, one of my largest karmic stories and potentially karmic struggles has to do with the way how I personally am using my money in my lifetime, and possibly the fact that I'm giving a great amount of my money to my siblings. And the reason why we say that she could be giving a great amount of her money to her siblings is because the third house is representing the siblings in general, and we have the ruler of the second house here in the third house, which can be indicative of the fact that a great part of my own financial assets is going to my siblings, and as a result of me giving over so much of my own stuff to my siblings, I find myself being in a contentious relationship between me and my monies, because it just doesn't feel as if it's making the most financial sense, this financial dynamic that's manifesting between me and the siblings, if I do have siblings. We don't know if she has siblings. We're making assumptions, which is a part of why giving a blind chart reading isn't a very sustainable way to do astrology in general. However, if she did have siblings, then this could be one of the stories that's manifesting here within her life. Now, another thing that we have here is the Mars, and it could have been in opposition to the Saturn, but it's not really in opposition to the Saturn, because at Oraculos, we only take tight aspects. And the reason we only take tight aspects is because the tighter the aspect, the more profound the impact of that thing on the life of the person. So we will not say that she has the Mars in an oppositional relationship with Saturn, but we will note that Saturn is ruling the fourth house, which represents her family, but particularly also her father specifically, and that Saturn is here within the third house. Now, when we have the ruler of the fourth house in the third house, that means we have our father in his own 12th house. When we have a person in their own 12th house, it's a little bit of a problem. If I were to have my spouse in his own 12th house, that would be my spouse in his house of self-undoing, which is, because it's 12 houses away from the 7th, which is my specific house of stress. So we don't like to see our spouse in their own 12th house. Neither do we like to see anybody in our own 12th house. Neither do we really like to see the ruler of our 12th house in any house. And here she has the ruler of her 12th house in the 4th house, and she has the ruler of the father in the 12th house. So that seems like a pretty specific statement as far as this chart is concerned, that says that the father of the family is a bit of a problem that's manifesting within the life of the native. Now, here's how that usually works out. When I have my daddy in his own 12th house, it can indicate that dad is lost to me. And what that very oftentimes means is that if the father was a present figure, the father was a bit of a nebbish figure, meaning that he wasn't really so available, he wasn't really so present, he wasn't really having an active hand as far as the parenting was concerned. He probably was out on the road all day and came home and plopped himself in front of the television and didn't say a word to anyone. And therefore, I grew up with a very strong sense of not having really the greatest father or the greatest paternal story within this lifetime. So that's very often what we find when we have the father in his own 12th house. Because the 12th house could also be the house of somebody else's secret life, we might say that dad is probably also possibly having a secret life. We're going to look more into that when we bring this chart up on the dial, but for all intents and purposes, that could be one of the things that this is indicating, that there could be a story of secrecy or something that isn't so clear as far as the father is concerned, and as a result of that, that's making dad seem like even more of a distant figure within the life of the native. Now, the next thing that we can say about this, based on the ruler of the 12th house being in this 4th house, is that the things that tie into my self-undoing and the people who tie into my self-undoing, in other words, my hidden enemies, are manifesting here within the home environment. because we would like to believe that having Venus in the fourth house would be a benevolent thing in general. However, we see within this chart that her having Venus in the fourth house may not necessarily be the most benevolent thing in the world, because Venus in this chart is a functional malefic. In traditional astrology, planets have various designations. A planet can be a malefic universally, just because that's what that planet is, such as Saturn is a universal malefic, Mars is a universal malefic. However, a planet can also be a functional malefic if that planet is located, or rather, if that planet is ruling a malefic house. And this Venus is most assuredly ruling a malefic house. And she's at 23 degrees Aquarius, 21 minutes in the fourth house. So that is saying that the family story, the familial story, could be a fixed source of challenges within the life of the native, and that the family story, the familial story, could be a fixed source of what seems to be thwarting or what seems to be undermining the life of the native. And that might be something that she sees within her family home as just a given fact of family relations, and that's just a given fact of the reality of that environment, and it may not have felt like the greatest environment in the world from the perspective of support. Now, once again, we see that this is Venus. We would like to think that the Venus is able to accomplish a little bit more within the context of this chart. And at best, what Venus could be accomplishing is saying that this is a family where people sing, or this is a family where there is an artistic influence in the environment, because Venus universally is representing art and music and aesthetically pleasing things. So this could be a very aesthetically pleasing bourgeoisie family set of circumstances. However, with Venus ruling the 12th house, it does not seem to be manifesting in the most positive of ways on the ground in terms of the actual lived experience of the family. Now, we see this Venus not just ruling the 12th house, but the Venus is also ruling the 7th house. The 7th house in traditional astrology is the house of your spouse. In traditional Indian astrology, they create a distinction between love marriage coming from the 5th house and arranged marriage coming from the 7th house. Now, in the West, we don't really have a context for arranged marriage. Actually, I don't know that, because I haven't seen all there is to see in the West. But the point is, we really don't have a context for arranged marriage from a Western perspective. And as a result of that, we do not view the 5th house as being a house of love marriage and the 7th house as being a house of marriage or arranged marriage. We just take the 7th house as the house of marriage. And so here she's having the ruler of her 7th house of marriage here within the 4th house. I've been doing some research on Chiron within the last 4, 5, 6 years of my life after being a very devout Chiron disbeliever. And I used to laugh at the people who spoke about Chiron, and that was until Chiron took me by the hair, in the words of Melanie Reinhardt, who I recently interviewed on the Oraculos podcast. If you want to hear our conversation, you could check out the interview between myself and Melanie Reinhardt, who is the first person in the Western world to ever give a talk on Chiron. And she wrote the book on Chiron, Chiron and the Healing Journey. I've been doing some independent research on Chiron, and a part of that is because I don't really like to read what other people write on new things I'm going to integrate into my astrology. I rather see it myself. I rather see it in action myself. And one of the places where my Chiron research began was with the Moon Chiron story. Many people, and I dare say 9 out of 10 people in the universe, who tell me that they have Moon Chiron in their chart also have a very harrowing story about their mother. I've never seen more challenging maternal stories in my life than the stories I hear with people who have the Moon Chiron. My mother didn't love me. My mother said she wanted a boy, but she got a girl. She wanted a girl, but she got a boy. My mother locked herself in the bedroom. My mother was on horse tranquilizers. My mother was in a mental institution. My mother had schizophrenia. All of these things about the mother. There always seems to be a very potently painful story about the mother within the life of the native. when a person has moon Chiron. And I'm just saying that as a segue into the fact that this lady has Venus Chiron. Now, while she doesn't have moon Chiron, what she does have is the moon at the southern bending. The southern bending is something that we should not sleep on in astrology. The bendings of the nodes in general isn't a topic that we should sleep on in astrology because the bendings of the nodes seem to carry the impact of the nodes themselves. So the southern bending seems to act like a representative of the south node, as it were. And the northern bending seems to act like a representative of the north node. So in this chart, the southern bending is 9 degrees of Gemini, and so said, so done, that's where her moon is. And the northern bending would be 9 degrees of Sagittarius, where she has nothing whatsoever. I consider the south node to be one of the toilet bowls of the universe, which means I also consider the southern bending to be one of the toilet bowls of the universe. And more often than not, when a person has their mother in a conjunction to the southern bending, it once again amplifies the story of the challenges surrounding the matriarchal lineage of the person's family. We see this in spades, however, because we see the moon in the 8th house, which is a house of anxiety, which represents anxiety surrounding the mother. We see the moon also in a quincunx relationship to Neptune. And the quincunx relationship to Neptune is one of the more challenging, I'm not going to call it an aspect because I was recently reprimanded for calling the quincunx an aspect, but I don't know what to call it, because it's actually a very important planetary something that we do throw into the kettle with the other aspects when we're interpreting them. So don't shoot the messenger. Anyway, we see the moon in the quincunx relationship with Neptune. We very often, not invariably, always, but we very often see moon Neptune stories in difficult digestive system charts. And by difficult digestive system charts, it just means that there is something foundationally occurring within the digestive system of the native that may seem as if it's unfunctioning or as if it's malfunctioning, it's underfunctioning, because the influence of Neptune from a medical astrology perspective is to throw a wet blanket on whatever it is afflicting. So if you have the moon being afflicted by the Neptune, then that could be my digestive system is having a wet blanket thrown on top of it, which might make it a little bit more difficult for me to digest foods. It might make it a little bit more difficult for me to absorb the proper nutrients in foods, because it's as if my digestive system in general is waterlogged. So that's one of the things that we find with the moon Neptune as a combination. And just on a very plain vanilla level, moon Neptune could mean being allergic to everything, being allergic to water, being allergic to flour, being allergic to air, being allergic to waking up. Basically, as long as there's a thing that impacts how a person eats food, moon Neptune very often can manifest as very extreme dietary sensitivities, but more so because of Neptune's squashing ability. Neptune squashes the fire that we oftentimes find in things, and that squashing of the fire might make the native a more watery person, which is lovely, because that watery component of her makes her more compassionate, more understanding, more caring, more tapped in, more tuned in, more turned on, more aware of how other people are organizing themselves emotionally around her. However, at the same time, we do note that the Neptune is still having that squashing factor, and with the moon it could be a squashing factor as far as the digestion. If I were an astrologer who really gave the signs of the zodiac far more precedence within my practice, I would say that since the moon is in Gemini, and since Gemini is also having to do with the lungs specifically, that the moon Neptune could also manifest as someone who is having potentially chronic respiratory challenges. And the reason for that is because the Gemini is having to do with the lungs, and so that's one of the ways how that can manifest. However, I'm not assigned to the zodiac type of person in general, and as far as the lung story would be concerned, I would want to see Mercury as a part of that affliction as well, and we don't see Mercury a part of that at all within the context of her chart. So anyway, the point of all of this was that we were talking about the way how the maternal challenge is showing up within this chart. And we see that through the moon in the 8th house of anxiety, which could say that my mother is a source of anxiety. We see that through the moon at the southern bending, which can either say that I lost the maternal piece, I lost the notion of motherhood or being mothered specifically, because like I said, the south node is a toilet bowl. So if something is with the south node, that's something that's being flushed out of our lives and that we don't really have access to. So that could be an indication that I lost the maternal piece, or it could also be an indication that even if the maternal piece was there, it might as well it had been lost, because it was a very challenging part of my life that I had to organize myself around. We have the moon in a square relationship with the Pluto. And the moon square Pluto is another one of the medical astrology significators of the stomach and of things that tend to go bump in the night within the digestive system specifically. But if I were creating an assessment on the side, which is something that people ask for, they say, hey, I'd like for you to look at my chart and tell me, based on looking at my chart, what are some of the things or some of the areas of my health that you think I can bolster or that I can work on with my complementary medicine practitioner, whether that's my acupuncturist or whether that's my shiatsu practitioner or whether that's my herbalist. What is something that I can be bolstering within this lifetime? I would say to her that the digestive system is definitely showing up in spades as something that she should be paying attention to. So these are the things as we see from the maternal perspective. But we only got to the maternal story tangentially because we really meant to be talking about the paternal story and about the father specifically, and about how the father specifically probably isn't showing up in the best of ways within this story. Now, within traditional astrology, one of the things we do as far as parenthood is concerned is we divide the parents based on the triplicity rulers of the specific houses of the parents. So we know that the 4th house is the house of father and land and immovable property and the family in general and orchards and fields and the house and all of these things. So the ancients said, how can we divide the topics of this 4th house so that we know that we can specifically be talking about the father versus talking about the land versus talking about this person's apple orchard versus talking about anything else? So they said, we will take the first triplicity ruler of the 4th house. This is a nocturnal chart, which is the first thing we have to do when we're discovering who the triplicity rulers are. This is a nocturnal chart, which means the triplicity rulers of her 4th house are going to be Mercury as the first triplicity ruler, followed by Saturn as the second triplicity ruler, followed by Jupiter as the third triplicity ruler. You don't need to know about the Saturn and the Jupiter. All you need to know about is the Mercury. That within this lifetime, Mercury is the first triplicity ruler of her 4th house and therefore specifically representing her father within this chart. We've already seen the Mercury in opposition to the Mars, which is indicative of the fact that for this native, her relationship to her father specifically could be one of a great level of contention and clashing, and as if the two of them aren't able to come together in a way that feels mutually beneficial or mutually supportive. Someone asked me a question about mitigation the other day, and I said that within astrology, there really aren't things that mitigate, but there are things that soften. So once again, in a perfect world, this Venus in the 4th house would be a wonderful softening effect as far as the familial story is concerned. And it could make this be a family of artists or a family of musicians where she played the cello and her sister played the piano and everybody in this family was doing something artistic, because that's very often something that we find when we have Venus within the 4th house in general. It creates an artistic family environment. We also have Neptune rising within this chart, and Neptune rising within this chart can also give the native a certain proclivity towards things of an otherworldly nature, and very often are chart is a thing of an otherworldly nature. So that could be very much manifesting within her life. We're going to go over and check and see if she's having the mundane aspect of Venus-Neptune, because I think that that's going to be very useful for us, especially in terms of talking about the love story within this native's life. So let's see it. This is Nova Chart Wheels. Nova Chart Wheels is the best thing since sliced bread as far as Uranian astrology is concerned, symmetrical astrology, all of these things. There's nothing quite like Nova Chart Wheels in the universe. And so we're just taking a look at some of the things going on here. But what I really wanted to look at was this, which is called the polar azimuthal. And the polar azimuthal gives us an understanding of the mundane aspects within this chart. Mundane aspects are also called parans. And paran is short for paranatilanta. And paranatilanta means that when something was rising in her chart, something else was rising with it. Even if the two of them aren't in a regular zodiac-based relationship, they might still be in a relationship by paran. Or something could have been rising while something else was setting, or something could have been rising while something else was culminating. The list goes on and on. So I want to see whether or not she has any paran relationships between this Venus and this Neptune, because if she does have a paran relationship between the Venus and the Neptune, that's essentially going to tell us that this lady is having a Venus-Neptune story. So help me God. So we're taking the Venus to the ascendant. And while she doesn't have a Venus-Neptune story, what we do see is that she has, when Venus was rising, how do we see rising? The red circle is the only thing you need to focus on this entire thing. Only focus on the red circle. And we just want to see two things or more things, two or more things being co-present on the red circle at the same time. So, while she had Venus rising, she had Uranus setting. Why? Venus is on the circle, Uranus is on the circle. We don't see Chiron on the circle. Chiron is close, but Chiron is a little bit far from the circle. But we do see that she has the exact Venus-Uranus story, which is definitely going to come up when we start talking about the love side of things. We also see she has the Moon-Uranus story. Do we see it? We see that if we could extend the line of this moon would also be on the red circle. So that's also to be known that the moon is a part of this. So she has Venus, she has the moon, she has Uranus. Having moon Uranus is often a thing that can give us a finicky digestive system. And I don't mean to be harping on the digestive system, but it's a thing that we see manifesting within this chart specifically. The moon Uranus can be something that gives somebody a very finicky, a very touch and go digestive system. And usually when someone is having moon Uranus, they don't actually have the sort of dietary issues as somebody who has moon Neptune. Because moon Neptune tends to manifest more specifically as someone who's having a very specific dietary problem, whereas moon Uranus tends to manifest as someone who is just having food specifications that aren't actually a big deal, basically. But she has the moon in the quincunx to the Neptune and the moon in this mundane square with Uranus, and so it's even further highlighting the food story within her life. Venus-Uranus is something that we find coming up for a couple of reasons. One of the ways how Venus-Uranus can come up is from a menstruation perspective. And when a woman is having Venus-Uranus, it can oftentimes feel, and I don't really like to talk about feelings, but it can oftentimes manifest as a very erratic menstrual situation. And the reason why we say a very erratic menstrual situation is because Venus is representing the womb, and Venus and the moon collectively are representing the womb from a traditional astrology perspective, and throwing Uranus into the womb can create a very erratic sort of environment. And so, once again, if I were to write up a report, and truthfully at the end of the day as astrologers, we can only write what we see. In the airport, when you go in the airport, they say if you see something, you say something. And so all we ever do as astrologers is we write what we see within the context of what we know, even though we know that we're filtering what we say and what we see through the filters of our own interpretational model, and not everybody's interpretational model is going to be correct. However, more often than not, Venus-Uranus can come up as creating a very erratic menstrual story within the life of a woman, and it can also be that some months there's heavy bleeding, some months there's light scanty bleeding, some months the period doesn't come at all. There can be a very Uranian or a very weird, Uranus is strange, Uranus is weird. There can be a very weird relationship to the menstrual story. Within the charts of men, Venus-Uranus can manifest as a very erratic sperm count. And this is something that can happen for a number of reasons. It can happen because there could be something such as a prostatitis or an inflammation of the prostate that can be having an impact on the sperm count. And so whereas the Venus-Uranus within the chart of a woman could manifest as the erratic menstruation, Venus-Uranus within the chart of a man often manifests as an erratic sperm count. And it can also sometimes manifest as a sterility within the charts of men if it is too extreme. So I'm just giving you languaging surrounding these things because you should know the things. Some people know that the way how I do research from a medical astrology perspective is, even though I don't use the signs of the zodiac, I do still tend to group things based on signs. So if there are head things, I group them based on the head. If there are neck things, I group them based on Taurus. If there are respiratory things, I group them based on Gemini, even though I'm going to look at how they manifest from a planetary perspective. I still find the signs of the zodiac to be a convenient way of grouping things and sectioning things off. Venus-Uranus, beyond the fact of it being or manifesting as the menstrual instability, as it often does, it can also manifest as a hormonal instability, and that can have many ramifications. I tend to personally think of Venus as the thyroid, and that's because Venus is ruling the throat and everything within it, on top of her also ruling the womb as well as the female genitalia in general. So I tend to think of Venus as the thyroid, and I tend to think of the combination of Venus and Mercury as the parathyroids as well, because Mercury represents things that are minuscule, and we know that the parathyroids are minuscule and they are behind the thyroid gland. And so Venus-Uranus, if we had to talk about various ways how the thyroid can manifest within the chart of a person, if we had something such as Venus-Mars, Venus-Uranus, those things could be a hyperactive thyroid, whereas if we had things such as Venus-Neptune, Venus-Saturn, those things could be a hypoactive thyroid. So Venus-Uranus could be manifesting as a hyperactivity of the thyroid gland in general, and that's something that we see here within the context of the mundane aspects within this chart. Let's keep going through the Venus, because we want to see, I was still looking to see if the Venus-Neptune was a story, and the Venus-Neptune still doesn't seem to be a story, and no matter how far we take it, that Neptune and that Venus are not on the red circle at the same time. So the point is that the Venus-Neptune story is a bit of a nebbish story that's not really happening. Now, she has the Venus in general in a conjunction with the Chiron, and this Venus is ruling the 7th house. One of the things I landed on very early within my personal Chiron journey, and I won't call it a journey because I don't, my life could do without Chiron, but one of the things I landed on very early in terms of my personal Chiron story is that Chiron seems to act like a baby Saturn. So if a person is having Venus Chiron within their chart, then that could feel very much like a Venus-Saturn conjunction. And we know that Venus-Saturn is one of the things that represents separation in love. That's the very textbook definition of Venus-Saturn. Now, I've augmented this before because I've said that Venus-Saturn can also represent everlastingness in love. However, we would need to see other things within the chart that also seem to speak in that same way of everlastingness in love. Because more often than not, 8 times out of 10, 7.5 times out of 10, Venus-Saturn is manifesting as a divorce signature and not necessarily as a together forever signature. So that's something that I just hold in my mind regardless as far as Venus-Saturn is concerned. So if I'm using Chiron as a proxy of my Saturn, then in my mind I'm also thinking that the Venus-Chiron connection could represent the same thing as far as the love side of things is concerned. Years after the Chiron thing began for me, I started to realize that this isn't just representing a sense of Saturn, there's also an additional piece. And when there's Venus, Chiron, it can be that the people who are together could be together based on one of them possibly being unwell. It could be that they're together based on a definite sense of needing to take care of one of them, that one of them is once again unwell and needs to be taken care of. And what it means is my love story, Venus, is being Chironed. And Chiron has to do with rejection and abandonment and being alone. And the story of Chiron is that his mother threw him in a cave and then she turned herself into a tree. So the whole Chiron story is a story of not necessarily feeling as if I have the sort of systems of support around me in general to take care of me. And when we bring Venus into that story, it becomes I don't feel as if I have the sort of systems around me in terms of love to take care of me. On the 90-degree dial, we see that she has the Venus here, when I put the pointer on the Venus, and the Venus is pulling in this Saturn by a very, very, very small dot, but it's a Saturn all the same. And that for me is saying that she has a Venus-Saturn story. She has a Venus-Saturn story, she has a Venus-Mars-Sun story, and so all of these things are standing out as far as further corroborating the fact that this could very much be one of our divorce signatures. Now, we want to look at this a little bit more closely, just so that we know that whatever we're saying it sagaciously. And once again, this is something that we feel as if she would have already experienced earlier within her life. And if she hasn't experienced this, then we are very happy about that. And one of the things is if a person says they haven't experienced something, we never argue with them to tell them that it just hasn't happened yet. Because if a person says no, we take it at that. So we take a look at the Sun Moon midpoint at 517, which gives us some understanding of what's going on within the love life specifically. Sun Moon midpoint isn't really tying into anything here. So we come back up here again and take a look at the Venus by itself. Her Venus is at 243. This midpoint listing is essentially the same as the dial we were just looking at, but the midpoint listing gets us there faster because I see 243 here, so I'm going to go down in the chart and look for 243 down here in the chart and see if I see it. She has the Venus at 243, she has the Chiron at 232, she has the Saturn at 230, and so she has Venus, Chiron, Saturn, Jupiter. If we had to put all of that together and speak about that as a story, we would say that the love that she experiences is with someone of a Chironian nature, probably someone who's sick, probably someone who's an outcast, probably someone who feels like no one in the world is ever going to love them. So the love that she experiences is with someone of a Chironian nature, and that becomes a major source of the Saturn in their relationship. What does Saturn mean? Saturn could mean that becomes a major source of the blockage or the conflict, or a major source of the karmic learning that she has to do in that relationship, in this lifetime with that person. All of those things apply. And we also have Jupiter here as a part of that combination. So she has the Jupiter, the Saturn, the Chiron, the Venus, all of the things. And so that could read as the foreign person foreign, as in not from here, Jupiter, who I, Venus, fall in love with, is someone who is manifesting as a Uranian person, or someone who I'm having to take care of, someone who I'm having to nurture, to feed, to hold, to support, to make sure that that person is okay. And that is also serving as a major source of what's probably a blockage or a challenge within our overarching relationship dynamic as a result of the Saturn being there as well. Now, I'm a person who believes that everybody has their entire lifetime to figure out how to work with the various things that occur within their chart. And so I don't think that it is beyond the power of anyone to see that, hey, this thing is really manifesting as a challenge between us, let's fix it. Because I think that if two people want to be together and if two people commit themselves to fixing something, then it's 1,000% possible that that thing can be fixed, most definitely. And for other people with this same combination, they might find themselves saying, this relationship is a bit heavy for me, it's a bit burdensome for me, and I feel as if as a result of it, I need to step away from it, which could be manifesting as one of the tricky areas or one of the divorce stress points that could be within this chart. Now, the last thing we'll say here, because I know that I've been speaking about this too long, is that she has the Venus and the Uranus contact as well. And Venus and Uranus is a lovely thing for the love of astrology. When we have Venus, Uranus, it says, I love my astrology loves me, my astrology has never let me down, I've never let my astrology down, all is well within my life as far as my astrology is concerned. So Venus, Uranus is love, Venus of astrology, Uranus. We love that for her. She's in the right place at the right time at this moment, sitting down talking to us. Venus, Uranus can oftentimes be one of the things that says, I love love, but I love the novelty of love. And more than really liking the novelty of love, I love freedom. And so the love of freedom could turn relationships into friendships, and it could turn friendships into relationships, and it may not necessarily be something that she struggles with balancing between. It could be that, I love you today, but I don't necessarily love you like that tomorrow, and I'd rather us just have freedom and a lot of space between us. And so that could create a scenario. For some people, it creates a scenario of a serial monogamy where they're going and they're meeting lots of people and going from relationship to relationship to relationship. And for other people, they could just create a very interesting dynamic within their love life with their partner so that they don't necessarily manifest love in the traditional or the orthodox sort of way. Because of the mundane square she has between the moon and Uranus, we don't even think that she is manifesting womanhood within a traditional orthodox way. I'm looking one more time to see the love story, 1632. So as a result of all of these factors combined, we get the overarching sense that since the way how she is dealing with herself as a woman is manifesting in a way that is Uranian and strange and exciting and that fits her specific specifications, the way how her love life is manifesting could also be doing the same thing. The last thing we see in this chart, which is well worth noting on that theme of not manifesting womanhood or motherhood in the traditional sort of way, is that she has the ruler of the first house in opposition to the ruler of the fifth house. That could mean a lot of things. And what it can oftentimes mean, especially in the chart where we see someone having moon Uranus, as she has the mundane aspect between moon Uranus. And does she even have that as a zodiac aspect? No, she doesn't. She doesn't have the zodiacal aspect of moon Uranus. She only has the mundane aspect of moon Uranus, which is this one over here, as I showed you all before. This is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I promise that I'm going to shut up. So here we have the moon. What was it? I think she had the moon, Uranus. Yes, that is it there. She has the moon, Uranus in a Paran relationship. The moon is anti-culminating at the same time that Uranus is setting. So we might as well say that she had the moon, Uranus square within her chart. That can manifest a lot of times as someone who doesn't want to show up in the role of maternity at all. And if it ends up happening, it could happen as a surprise sometimes for the most part, because it isn't necessarily something that the maternal factor could be something that stifles or takes away from the larger sense of freedom that she would like to have within this lifetime. And so since that maternal factor does that, she probably could say, hey, I'll take care of everybody else's kids, but I don't necessarily feel like the children's story is a big story that I want to participate with in this lifetime. And a day ago, we saw that within the chart of somebody else who had Venus in a square relationship with Pluto and the South Node in her fifth house. But here we see a very similar story with the ruler of the ascendant opposite the ruler of the fifth house. Sometimes ruler of the ascendant opposite the ruler of the fifth can be that there's just a tense story in my life in general as far as the story of me being a mother is concerned. But very often, ruler of the ascendant opposite the ruler of my fifth house is that I'm not a mother. And I don't want to be a mother because being a mother takes away from the larger structure of all of the other things I'm trying to establish in my life, which is something that we often see as well when someone has the quincunx relationship between the moon and the sun, because the moon and the sun could represent that within my family story, I didn't really see the story of parenthood or being parented manifest in the nicest or the most loveliest of ways, because I have the ruler, the universal significator of my mother is in a quincunx with the universal significator of my father. So I didn't really see the family dynamic playing out in the best of ways. And truthfully, probably very early on within my life, I experienced trauma as being a very real part of the family dynamic, and that created a very real level of family instability. And as a result of that, I don't necessarily want to replicate that within the karmic unfoldings of my life, and therefore I will take care of the neighbor's children because I feel as if I can stand in that role a little bit stronger or a little bit easier or a little bit more comfortably than me stepping into the role of being a mother within my own right in terms of my own offspring. So these are some of the things that we see manifesting within this chart. It is a very dynamic chart. I didn't get to do all the things with it I thought that we would have done. We spent more time within the traditional framework than bringing in the other pieces as well. But it took us for a spin, and I'm very eager to hear from the person whose chart this is, where this landed or how this landed for you this evening.
Hey, Michael.
Hi, how are
Well,
you?
that was an interesting interpretation. A lot of it was correct. You got a lot of information overall. As a child, I had gastritis and dehydration problem when I was a baby and almost died. So that would be the beginning of the digestive issues. I've had allergies to eggs, tomatoes, and a few other things, but I still continue to eat them. I moderate myself depending on what's going on and where I am at the time. I was a vegetarian for 18 years of my life and realized that I really needed to have meat in my diet to help with the digestion, because just vegetables alone is not enough for my system. When it comes to the dynamics with my family, well, yes. My mother and I and my father and I relationship always strained. I'm the eldest of three. My brother was born 11 months after I. And when he was born, my parents moved, and I was in the hospital at the time, and they brought him home before me. So it was kind of a challenging dynamic. My sister was the favorite. She was the unexpected child. And my father leaned towards giving her praise. And I was always the quiet and the outspoken one and the one that challenged everybody. My father, Leo sun, Leo moon. Mother, Cancer sun, Scorpio moon. So you can see how that fuels that. Both my brother and sister, my brother is an Aries sun, Aquarius moon. My sister is a Pisces sun and Aquarius moon. So that feeds even more dynamically into that story. My brother and I stopped talking probably some 8 or 9 years ago. He would send messages through my mother. And so we don't speak. 3 years ago, my mother wrote me a daughter letter. It didn't even say dear. It just said daughter, and kind of ended the relationship. The last time I saw my father was about 8 months before he died, and he accused me of being jealous of my sister, which I found interesting since I never was. As far as my personal life goes, I was flying airplanes when I was 18. I ran away from home Christmas Day, so a few days before my 19th birthday, the first time. I always had a bag packed. I had friends who flied, so within the area of Reading, which was a airport where a lot of people learned to fly, I could pick up the tower from the stereo radio in my bedroom. Then if I heard a friend flying, I could call the tower and say, hey, stop that plane, and I would literally get to the airport in 8 minutes and jump on that plane and take off. So yeah, I wanted to be a pilot, but because I was female at that time, I applied for Freedom Airlines, and that didn't go anyplace. But I joined the Air Force when I was 19, had a medical discharge. I had a bicycle accident when I was 10 years old. My neighbor let me take his bike for a ride and went to the top of the hill. He didn't tell me it didn't have brakes. And when I was on the way down, I had a choice between a parked car and a moving car. I took the parked car and got a concussion. I had pneumonia when I was 9. I don't have respiratory issues, but I am not a deep breather. I do have a challenge with that. I am married. I've been married for 31 years. My husband is an Aquarian, so we both have a lot of independence. I had lots of jobs growing up, my 20s and my early 30s, where I'd work for a company and I'd come in and be a fixer, fix a situation. As soon as I got worked out, I move on to the next job and do the same thing over again. I come in, I take care of a situation, get everybody on the right path, and I move on. When my husband and I got together, he actually is a New Zealander, and we eloped and we got married in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Part of our relationship, he was on the road commuting. He'd leave on a Sunday and come home on a Thursday. I went back to school to get my interior design degree in the late 90s. Here, I live in Phoenix, but I commuted to Los Angeles every week for 2 years to get my degree. My last job before I met my husband, I was actually working for a company who was in Los Angeles, but I still lived in Phoenix, so I commuted. So I commuted for that job for 2 years. So there's lots of, going back and forth between 2 different states, feeling like I have to be someplace else all the time. I've lived in Sydney. My husband and I lived in Sydney and spent 3 months in New Zealand some time back. We're thinking about moving overseas again. So yes, there is that international dynamic. I always feel at home in another country. Immediately, I feel like I belong there. That's my local environment. So I don't have any issues with that. Let me think. What else did you bring up? My father. The only way my father and I really connected growing up as a kid was playing sports. I was a really good baseball player. I wanted to be a pitcher. And so we would throw baseballs or footballs in the street, and I had a better arm than my brother did, which my father used to find irritating about my brother. So yes, I was very competitive. My husband will tell you that I'm still fairly competitive. And yes, I haven't had a lot of friends. I have friends that I've had for a really long time, but we're not what I would call close. We'll touch base, every year or every several months, and we'll pick up where we left off. But as far as bringing people into an inner circle, I'm challenged with that a lot. I feel like a lot of times where I'm in group settings, where I'm with a group of people, that they have a challenging time with listening to hear what I have to say. And as far as being visible, yeah, that's part of that. But when I come into a group, generally I sneak into the room in the background, and then I'll make my way to the front, and then I'll take over at the podium, so to speak. So yeah, I do understand that dynamic. Let's see, what else? Yes, hyperthyroid, active thyroid, definitely. Have had issues with that. Been tested, but honestly, I'm one of those kind of persons that don't believe in a lot of the medical stuff, so I haven't treated it medically because I feel like my body can heal itself from a lot of those issues.
But there has been a diagnosis of hyperthyroidism.
There was probably 1990. No, it's before that. It was probably 1986, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. But that was also at the time where people were doing a lot of the hormone replacement therapy, the HRT and that kind of stuff. And I really wasn't comfortable with it because I felt like it would mess up my body more. So I never went down that route. There were a lot of books on the subject at that time in the late 80s and people talking about it. And I revisited it a few times. Maybe the last time was 2017. And I just was like, you know what, this just does not resonate with me. I feel like I'm better apt at changing my diet and at adapting myself to it as opposed to taking a pill every day for the rest of my life. So I never went that route. As far as the divorce signature, well, my sister got divorced in 2018 after 34 years of marriage. So it's played out more in the familial dynamic than with myself. My husband does have leg strength issues. So that would be Uranian, and he does have, he's got a chart with intercepted houses, so his 5th and 6th house are ruled by Sagittarius, and he is Aquarian. So his chart complements my chart in a lot of ways, so we balance each other out. So when you see them together, it's like OMG kind of thing. As far as the musicality side, I played clarinet when I was like 8 or 9 years old and played in the high school band and the orchestra. My brother played saxophone. My sister played flute. I used to write songs as a child, and I also played guitar. And I played an organ. My mother, she wasn't a singer. She tried to sing, but she did write songs, and she wrote poems, and she's a published poet. My father was always the instigator. He was the troublemaker in his family. So the secrets have to do with the dynamics in his own family. My grandmother, his mother, had a child out of wedlock before they got married, and that child died like at 1 year old. And I wasn't aware of it until I was like in my 30s. It was a secret. There was lots of secrets about the family because my dad's father was an alcoholic, and so he had to get a driver's license when he was 14 so he could take my grandmother to the hospital because she was a diabetic and she needed to be able to be driven, and he was not dependable. So there was a lot of secrecy around that. My dad's brother was 10 or 11 years younger than him. And so there was another challenging aspect in that relationship. So even though my father was the oldest, technically he wasn't. He was this middle child. And so there was a strained relationship within the family. So he was not the favorite with his father either. So it kind of like he played it out with me as well from that perspective.
From a medical perspective, I did mention the menstrual story within your earlier life as well. So could you talk to us about that, please?
Yeah, you're pretty much spot on that. I was pregnant 3 times, and the last one was a miscarriage. And yes, I would have painful cycles, and then I would have missed cycles, and it was erratic. I have not had migraines. My mother had the migraines. My mother had really bad migraines. I get tension headaches every now and again. I usually massage them out in the temples. I do have, stress on a regular basis. I'm hyperactive. I don't sit still. So, yeah, as far as the menstrual cycles go, you're absolutely correct. But I have no children, so yeah, I never felt the need that I had to be a mother. That if it happened, okay, great. But when you commute for school for 2 years of your life in your mid 30s, and you're in 2 different places, and then when you're overseas living someplace else, it's not a top of mind. Freedom and independence reign in my chart.
Awesome. So
And they reign in my husband's too. So
awesome. Okay, so the last thing I want to ask you is there anything that you could tell us that just didn't land for you at all, that felt like it was absolutely incorrect for you?
there was something about when you were talking about the moon and the eighth, and I didn't write myself a note. That's when I was like, oh, I should be writing notes here so I can go back to remember what he said. But I've never had problems speaking out. I'm definitely not what somebody would call a wallflower, for sure. Yeah, there was something.
The only thing I said about the moon and the eighth was about the mother, and I started this whole thing about the mother at the southern bending and in the
Oh,
eighth
I know
house.
what it was. It was about money. It was the issues about money. Yes, money has always been very central to me, and it's been really important dynamic. However, I spent, prior to coming back into astrology and really focusing on it the last couple of years, I was a kitchen and bath designer and a remodel contractor. So I've always been protective of other people's money with contractors in that they're doing the job within the amount that they agreed to. So from that perspective, yes, I've always been taking care of other people's money, and it's been important to me that people don't get taken advantage of. So yeah, so that would be also the Venus Uranus thing playing out, and also the Pluto thing playing out, because my remodeling career is not coming in and doing a fluff remodel. I'm going to basically blow the whole thing up and rip everything out down to the studs, and we're going to start over. That's the kind of projects that I would do. So I've actively played out my chart in ways that other people might not anticipate, working that energy with coming in and looking at a problem. And because I am also psychic, and I pick up on other people's what's going on in the family dynamic, I become part of the family while I'm doing the remodel project. And when I leave, there's kind of like this separation anxiety that they go through with me, because most of my projects last 1.5 to 2 years when I was doing them. So I've been through family birth, death, marriages, divorce during that process. And in the last couple clients, I did become aware of dynamics outside of the family that I would share with the client. Like when the father passed over, I would pass on messages, and it changed the dynamics of the relationship. So yeah,
Awesome.
That's for sure.
And I know that the score thing is arbitrary, but from 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest, how would you score this in relation to your life?
Probably around 8.5, somewhere
Awesome.
in that area.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you so much to everyone who has participated in this blind chart reading marathon over the course of the last 6 days. For me, this is some of the most humbling work that I get to do in astrology. And even though there is a very big part of the blind chart reading space that is meant to be demonstrative or performative of the astrology itself, we still always do this work with the knowledge that we are picking up the story of someone's life and trying to curate that story and trying to share that story back with that person in a way that makes sense for them, where they don't have to wonder, well, what did he mean? Did he say it this way? Did he say it that way? But we're also trying to do it in a way that's respectful, because at the end of the day, when we practice natal astrology, we are literally practicing the astrology of human destiny. And so we want to do that in a way that's mature, in a way that's respectful, and in a way that honors the client as well as it honors this craft of astrology. The astrology that I've demonstrated for you over the last 6 days is the astrology that we practice and that I teach at the Oraculos School of Astrology. This, for me, represents excellence in astrological practice, because at the end of the day, when the world calls upon us as an astrological community to show up and show what this astrology can do, people aren't going to care about how good our counseling skills are. They're not going to care about how good we hold space for others. They're not even going to care about our understanding of language or mythology. What the world demands of astrologers is accuracy and being able to demonstrate concrete event-based astrology in action. If that's something that you want to experience and that you want to bring more deeply into your astrological practice, then please do come and study with us here at the Oraculos School of Astrology. These readings that I've done on the spot are readings that the students at the Oraculos School of Astrology routinely do, because this is what they learn to do so that they can go out into the world and represent the astrology that we practice and that we love for others as well. I know that this wasn't the most prepared, and on some days it wasn't even the most polished presentation, but this is real astrology, live astrology, raw astrology from the heart of a genuine astrological practice. So if you want to practice astrology in a concrete event-based way and you want to give your clients readings that both you and they can rely on, then please do consider joining our Professional Astrologers Diploma Program, which begins this September 2023, as well as our Medical Astrology Diploma Program, which begins this September as well. Thank you always for choosing Oraculos to be your astrological home. Until next time, I'm Mychal A. Bryan, leaving you in peace and love and hope. Until we meet again, have a good one. Bye-bye.